Hey guys, it's Kate and I hope you're having a great day. I'm here with my Marie's Masters watercolors and my Masters Touch paper that's cellulose and it's from Hobby Lobby, and I've been enjoying playing with it lately. So I'm working wet in wet today with an abstract background that I want to be very soft and blendy, and I'm using a limited palette, and that is right now I'm using phthalo blue green shade, and I'm also going to dip into yellow ochre, and I'm going to really kind of play into that green blue mix, which is one of my favorites. But the goal I had with today's video is to use acrylic paints with watercolor. Well, really over the top after it dries. I'm not mixing them while they're wet, but I was just thinking about how I do a lot of watercolor with doodles and a lot of acrylic in my art journal and different abstracts and stuff. And I really wanted to kind of blend that together. They're my two favorite mediums to work with. And I really like the softness and the transparency of watercolor mixed with the opacity and, sometimes more hard edges of acrylic. Not that you can't have hard edges with watercolor, but one of my favorite things about it is how it blends, just like it's doing right here on the paper, and you get these really soft, just wispy kind of backgrounds, and they're just so beautiful. And so what I wanted to do here was finish my background and then go over the top of it with a nice, easy little painting with some flowers. So that's what I'm doing here today, and I'm hoping that you'll follow along with me and maybe try some of these ideas for yourself. Mixing media is really fun to do, and a lot of us already use things like acrylic markers and stuff like that on top of our watercolor, especially after it dries if we're doing some abstract doodles or just kind of using the background for some inspiration and making different shapes and things. So I'm just kind of embracing that here, and I'm dipping into a darker color now to add some more values to the background here, and just going easily around the paper. So I sprayed the background before I started, and then I really love those little tendrils that kind of come out of the edges after you drop color onto a wet page. And you get that with a sort of a spray bottle that leaves a thicker spray, not really a mister. And I have both of those in my supplies that I use regularly. So one of the things that I'm really enjoying here is playing with the different mediums. So I've got some olive green, black, and white, and I just wanted to keep it really simple. So I grabbed a small angle brush, and I'm going to go in and make a few simple flowers. And I really, really love how that paint just pops right off the front of the watercolor. Now, if you're going to be trying this for yourself, something to just keep an eye out for is that unlike acrylic paint, which dries permanent, you could potentially lift watercolor pigment from your paper if you do a lot of brushwork. So I'm just trying to keep it pretty simple here and not reactivate the watercolor that's underneath. Although if you did it with purpose, you probably could get some really neat effects that way too, especially if you're using a color that will blend really well with your watercolor. So I'm just placing a few little flowers and buds, and this is really just an experiment, but I just loved how that white went over that blue and green background, and then the acrylic paint I'm using is also leaving a little bit of transparency in the center, and so it adds some extra depth to those little flowers, which I really loved. And with acrylic, you can just do something so delicate. It doesn't have to be overpowering, and it can really work well with your watercolor if you're painting over it. Another thing that some people do is using acrylic paint almost as a watercolor. You can water it down quite a bit and make it transparent too, and it will be permanent when it dries, unlike watercolor. But I really like just using watercolor as watercolor. And I like that you can lift and blend and do all those things that it's designed to do. So just kind of going in, I put in some stems. I had made a little bit of a thick line by pressing too hard on my angle brush, and so I brought back out my smaller round liner, and I am putting in stems for that and just kind of bringing them down toward the bottom of the page. And I'm not really thinking too much about composition or anything like that. I'm just really experimenting here and seeing how I like that look. And spoiler alert, I like it a lot. So I want to kind of explore this a little bit more as I go forward and really bring, my favorite things together. One thing I've been concentrating on a lot lately is to really focus on creating a lot of layers. And I think that acrylic paints mixed with watercolor or layer, I mean, really, when I say mix, I don't actually mean mix together, but layer over. Just to clarify, I don't want anybody ruining their palette of watercolor paints because they have a layer of dried plastic acrylic over the top. But when I mix the two and paint over a watercolor and layer it with acrylic, I think it has a lot of opportunities that you can have without working with a marker or something like that. And I think you can get some interesting effects with brushwork. And you could also make some of your watercolor more opaque. So for instance, if I was working on a composition and I had a really beautiful red watercolor, let's just say alizarin crimson, and it was this larger area of my painting, I could grab a similar or same color and go over certain parts of that after it dries and make it more opaque and bring some more depth into the watercolor painting. So that's one opportunity. Another opportunity might be to work on some shapes. You can also use acrylic underneath watercolor if you were going to do some line work, similar to what you might do with a acrylic paint marker or a fine liner, and do a bit of line and wash, but you could get some more texture that way with a thicker layer of paint. You really wouldn't be able to work watercolor on top of a whole layer of acrylic because it wouldn't absorb the same way as it does into your watercolor paper. But I think there's a lot of really neat ways to explore the technique, and I don't think that there are a lot of people that I have seen doing this, but I think it's a good opportunity to just experiment with our supplies and experiment with our creativity. And I'm kind of finishing up this painting here and getting my trusty old stylus to add some white dots, which I think really helped finish it off. And I will say I gravitated toward the white in this second layer, and if you have been watching me for a while, I like to do a lot of white marks with my pens, which really hate to work sometimes. And so that's another nice thing about using acrylic paint, and you could use white gouache as well. And gouache would be an excellent opaque alternative to put on top of watercolor also. But the white was a real pleasure to use because it didn't give me any trouble at all. So I finished it up, and I'd love to know your thoughts on how this turned out. My leaves are looking a little wonky because it looks like just a line across the page of leaves. So that, I think, was part that I didn't care for, but I hope you enjoyed this painting, and until next time, keep creating.